Today on Better Book Clubs, how to become more well-read. So this is the second in a two-part series on well-read readers. And before you watch this video, you might want to back up and watch my first video on what it means to be a well-read person or a well-read reader, and then come back to this video because today I'm going to give you some tips on how to negotiate that project, how to figure out what you're going to read, and also a little bit about how you're going to read it. So if you've already seen my video on what it even means to be well-read, you know that the definition of being well-read is pretty slippery. Assuming that a project of becoming a well-read reader is even possible, I want to give you some suggestions today on how to think about that project and how to maybe put it together. And I think the very first thing to understand is something that I want to illustrate by what happened when I was doing some research for this video and thinking about how to help you with this. I was reading an article in the Paris Review by a writer named John Jeremiah Sullivan. He was kind of, as many writers have done, addressing the question of what should I read in order to be a well-read reader, which is kind of an impossible question to answer. The very first author that he recommended was an author that I had never even heard of. It illustrates the difficulty of this project, the fact that it's basically impossible because everybody's got an idea of what would be on that list, and while there's overlap, there are also tons of possible suggestions for you to read. And so it's a very personal project, and it's also a lifelong project that you will never actually accomplish. So I think it's good to go into it understanding how massive a project it is to think of yourself as becoming a well-read reader. And I would add that probably anybody who's truly well-read doesn't think of themselves as well-read because you know how many other books are out there that you could be reading that would be part of being well-read and you haven't read them. So it's kind of a weird catch-22 sort of project. Catch-22, by the way, is not a bad reading suggestion. So the more you work toward becoming deliberately well-read, the more you'll realize that you'll never reach that goal. That doesn't nullify this pursuit in any way. It just means you have to be very process-oriented and enjoy the journey rather than being goal-oriented and wanting someday to attain that goal. So with that in mind, I would also argue that there are lots of right ways to do this and fewer wrong ways. I want to address what some of those wrong ways would be. So one wrong way to go about becoming well-read would be to read too narrowly. So you'll be deeply read in one particular field if you do that. And I would include among that reading only classics in the Western canon. That'll make you deeply read in the Western canon, but I would argue that that doesn't make you well-read because you would be neglecting all of the wonderful current literature that's being published. You would be neglecting the entire field of nonfiction. I don't know that you could consider yourself to be well-read if that's all you had read was Western classics. Another thing that I think we have to think about in terms of being well-read is keeping current with world affairs. The problem with that is that we have to be very careful these days about our news sources and choosing news sources that are reliable. So another wrong way to go about this project would be to be relying on a news source that is not as objective as possible. I found a great resource for this on the League of Women Voters website. They have a chart that shows you at the peak of the chart the most objective news sources, and then trailing off on either side, on the two side angles of the triangle, are the liberal news sources and the conservative news sources that are becoming less and less and less reliable as you go down the sides of the triangle. So I'll share a link to that website and that graphic for you in the section below so that you can go back and study it a little bit more carefully and think about where your trusted news sources are and whether you could move yourself up a little bit more towards the top where the sources are most objective. So those are a couple of wrong ways to go about becoming a well-read reader. But now let me give you some specific suggestions on things you could think about that might help you if you want to embark on a project of becoming more well-read. So the first part has to do with choosing what you're going to read. I have a few suggestions for sources that might help you pick some books to get you started. The first one is the AP list, which is the list for the advanced placement English classes in high schools, where high school students, if they take the AP and get a certain score on the test at the end, get college credit for it. That AP list tends to be classics of the Western canon. So that would be one source that you could use if you're not even sure what the Western canon is. And then it also tends to have a lot of fairly contemporary novels of importance on it as well. So that's a good place to look for fiction if you're looking to become more well-read. And it's also a good list to read from because a lot of people who are readers in the United States will have read a lot of the books on that list if they took AP English or they went to college and took a bunch of English classes. I've already talked about that League of Women Voters source for finding reliable news. If we're talking about being well-read, we're talking about reading news sources, but of course there are lots of broadcast sources as well that would give you the news. You know, if we want to define the term well-read more broadly, that's a way to be more well-read. If you want to listen to BBC Radio, for example, to get your news coverage, then you would be becoming more well-read in an informational sense, even if you're not literally reading on the page. And I would argue that that constitutes becoming well-read, even though it's not physically reading, just like reading an audiobook. While it's a different experience, you're still getting the experience of a novel. A third great source for finding books to help you become more well-read is to pay attention each season to the nominees for the major book prizes. So this is going to help you, for one thing, cut across genres a little bit because there are prizes not just for fiction, but also for nonfiction. There are groups that give very specific nonfiction prizes in history, for example. There are poetry prizes, there are drama prizes. So paying attention to those nominees each year gives you an opportunity to kind of read a little bit more broadly in books that are going to be really solid, well-written, interesting books to begin with. And again, I'll put a link or two below to help you find those lists of prize nominees. And a fourth suggestion is to subscribe to at least one periodical. Now, sometimes they're hard to keep up with. There's sort of this ongoing joke about the New Yorker, which comes out every single week, and how people just can't keep up with it, so they have stacks of New Yorker magazines next to their armchair. I mean, that's kind of an old-fashioned joke now because a lot of people would read it online. The sentiment is accurate that if something comes too frequently and you don't have enough time to read, that might not work out so well for you. But there are also monthly and quarterly publications. You're gonna have to do a little bit of digging to decide what kind of publication you want to read and what seems like it's part of the cultural conversation. I mentioned the Paris Review earlier, so that's one example of a kind of publication that, again, there's a breadth of genre in there that you can read from, but also there are publications like Smithsonian Magazine, which my husband subscribes to. That's just full of interesting geographical, historical stories, well-written, reliably sourced. So another example of something you could do to help yourself become more well-read is to pick just one, maybe two periodicals to become a subscriber to. There are also a few things you can do to help you with this project of becoming more well-read, regardless of what pieces you choose to read. So one suggestion that I'm actually working on myself, I just started this, but I want to show you what it looks like, is to make a 4-part list of your reading strengths and, I didn't call it weaknesses, but gaps. I just kind of made it into a grid, and I put strengths in the upper left corner and gaps in the lower right. And then I also have a box for emerging, meaning I'm reading a fair amount in that subject area, but I wouldn't say it's a strength of mine yet. So for me, that's reading in the areas of the environment, race in America, and Greek mythology, because I always felt that was a gap in my education. And then in the lower left box, I have interests. So something that maybe I'm not reading a lot of or much of yet, but I'm interested in reading more of. For me, that's those prize winners. I feel like I wish I could take more time and really more methodically pick several prize-winning books from the previous year to read. Also, I'm really interested in Afghanistan. I have a personal interest in reading about Afghanistan, and also contemporary poetry, which I'm very interested in, but I don't read read a lot of. Of these 4 boxes, that's probably the one that I would focus my attention on in choosing some things to help me actually start a project of becoming more well-read. And then also the gaps part. Obviously that means it's something that I feel like I should be reading more, but maybe something that I'm less interested in or compelled to read, something that I might have to more consciously choose to read. The first thing on my gaps list is reading about current science and technology. I just don't get drawn into those pieces, and yet I feel it's really important as a citizen to be reading more in that area. And my strengths obviously are English and American literature and also classic children's books, partly because I read them as a child and partly because I read a lot of them with my kids when they were younger. So those are areas where I already have a strength. If I want to become more well-read, maybe I shouldn't be reading as much in that box as I should in the other 3. So that's just one way of thinking about organizing your subject areas or the genres that you want to read in, and thinking more deliberately about what you're choosing to read. Another suggestion is to keep a list. You could do this like on your phone, that's where my list is, or you could make it more fun if you're a kind of creative person who wants to have a notebook and you could kind of make it into a project. But keep a list of books that people mention to you, because a lot of times people will mention a book and then, or an article or whatever, and you'll think, oh, I have to remember that, and then later on you don't. So you really want to write it down as soon as possible. That becomes part of the conversation that you're having as a well-read reader. Well-read readers tend to talk to other people about what they're reading. I mean, that's why you're here on BookTube, right? So you're probably already keeping a list like this, but if you're not, it's really important to write down the things that people suggest to you, which might help you broaden your reading into areas that you otherwise might not have run into. And finally, there are lots of articles, but even full books on becoming a more well-read reader. I don't necessarily recommend these because, again, it's such a personal project. So somebody else's program for being more well-read is unlikely to really mesh with you as a reader. It might be a good place to start, but then you have to be willing to branch off from that as you become more confident about choosing what you want to read. I will give you one suggestion if you're interested in a kind of classic, broadly ranging program that might help you become a more well-read reader, and that's the book The Well-Educated Mind by Susan Wise Bauer. She has this project for becoming well-educated, as she puts it, broken down into different genres. So there's a section on fiction, autobiography, history, drama, science, and poetry. And it's not just about what to read, but also about how to read it. And so I think that of the sources I know, that's probably a really helpful one for somebody who's just getting started. Becoming more well-read is, again, a lifelong project, so just embrace it as such. Maybe don't even think about it as a project, but think about it as part of who you are and just something you do. I'd also be really interested in hearing your comments and suggestions about what makes a well-read reader and also things that have been helpful to you in your own reading project. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.